We have engaged with presidents. We have engaged in high-level advocacy. And every time that we have engaged in those advocacy, we mention dialogue as being key to ending this.
More than 60 people were killed in attacks by Islamist militants.
3 principaux camps militaires FAMA attaqués le dimanche matin, pratiquement à la même heure et avec les mêmes modes opératoires.
We influence a debate significantly. We will continue to advocate for this despite the setbacks. I come from the Sahel myself, the heart of the Sahel actually. I come from a town called Zander in the southeast of Niger, toward the border of Nigeria. I grew up there, and this is a place that is not very far from Boko Haram's stronghold in the Lake Chad Basin. We had a new insurgency in Mali in 2012. And then that really became the issue that I was really interested in studying because it was threatening to me and my family and my community. Between 2015 and 2018, I spent at least 14 months in Mali, in Niger, in Mauritania, during which I met with a variety of actors, including violent actors, political actors, civil society groups, religious leaders, etc. Trying to understand the perspective of the dynamics that were going on the ground. So the crisis in Mali started in 2012 as a result of an insurgency by jihadist groups together with separatist rebel armed groups. They conquered major towns in northern Mali, expelling the state out of those towns, and they started to move toward the central part of the country when an intervention led by French forces, stopped them in some of the central towns and then chased them out of the major towns. Now, jihadist groups did not disappear after that intervention, but they went underground, particularly in rural areas and in mountainous regions in northern Mali. But after that, they reorganized themselves, and then they came back to continue waging insurgency wars, hit and run attacks against armed forces, and trying to expand their presence not only in northern Mali but to other regions. It was really very difficult on local populations because of the violence. Jihadists use violence to impose their presence to the local communities. Aside from the sanctions, they also, prevent government from bringing services to the local populations. You also have intercommunal violence that they instigate between different communities, mostly have been even more, deadly than the jihadist insurgency itself. When I joined the Crisis Group in 2018, it was the same time when the Crisis Group decided to create a Sahel project to focus on 3 countries that are faced with jihadist insurgency: Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. At that time, the insurgency had lasted for 6 years already. And countries were spending a lot of resources. The focus was on defeating jihadist groups. When we started that project, it was clear to us that military response was not sufficient. And it was unable to either defeat the jihadists or even slowing them down from reaching out to other places. Dialogue was a tool that was missing in the whole picture. So we started to advocate for the idea of engaging dialogue with jihadist groups. But at the time when we started to talk about dialogue, yes, it is true that there were other people who were already talking about it at the local level, but both actors, the main actors, including the government of Mali and the jihadist groups, were not ready for it. The Malian government was repeating one of the sentence that we heard from other countries, including the United States at the time, that we do not negotiate with terrorists. The jihadists also were saying that we do not bargain about God. So we came, first of all, with a report. Our idea really behind the report was to say that, look, there are objective obstacles and challenges to engage dialogue between jihadist groups and governments. And those obstacles were, first of all, the jihadists' demand, what they were asking for. They were asking for is the establishment of a caliphate, and that will be ruled by, the Sharia law. That demand is not acceptable from, democratically elected government and secular elite. The other challenge was that those groups has pledged allegiance to international jihadist networks, including al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The third obstacle was that you have other local groups who resisted the idea of dialogue with jihadist groups for a variety of reasons. And then the fourth obstacle was that you have international forces, international actors, including Western actors, who were exercising pressure on the Malian government to not accept such a dialogue with jihadist groups. For all those obstacles, engaging dialogue with those groups was really difficult. And we listened to that argument. We thought that there was something here that makes it particularly difficult. But it wasn't impossible. And it wasn't necessarily, crippling challenges or crippling difficulties. At that time, a variety of forms of engagement were already developing between jihadists and the local communities, between jihadists and humanitarian actors, between jihadists, and even some part of the government. People were able to achieve, some result, a ceasefire between communities and the jihadists, negotiating access by humanitarian actors to go there, and you realize that jihadists make compromises. They were able to be pragmatic in negotiations, and we thought that governments should also be pragmatic. In 2019, we come up with a report that laid down, our analysis on how dialogue could be effective. We organized a workshop in Bamako where we invited, different stakeholders, including representatives from the Prime Minister's office, and you have also other people who came from other ministries, Malian ministries. We also invited people from central Mali who were close to the jihadists. We invited the religious leaders who were debating with the jihadists constantly. We invited a variety of actors and put them in the same room and started to discuss, is this dialogue possible? When we started the discussions, you really have a heated debate between different actors. But at the end of that workshop, we realized that people have come to soften some of their positions, and we thought that was really a very positive signal. We expanded this advocacy to other countries in the region, including Burkina Faso and Niger. We engaged in advocacy at the highest level in the region, whether with President of Niger, the previous one, Mohamed Issoufou, engaged with the President Bazoum. We engaged also with high-level authorities in Burkina Faso at the level of ministers in charge of actually conducting those dialogues. At every one of those engagements, we mentioned the importance of dialogue as a tool that should be used. And we believe that some of the ideas that we conveyed to them had an impact in either convincing them or consolidating their position, reinforcing their position on those. Because Bazoum was one of the actors who were really championed the idea of dialogue with jihadist groups. The second thing that we did is to increase our engagement with the media at the local level, to try to influence the public opinion. We are not the only one who are doing that. There are other actors within the civil society at the local level who are also, but we added our voice. We engaged with people in the public opinion. We really noticed a shift in the public opinion in 2019, late 2019, early 2020, to the extent that there was almost no public gathering to talk about the crisis in Mali without the idea of dialogue being evoked as the way to go. So we thought that really that change in the public opinion was very significant in terms of pushing the political elite to also start changing their minds about dialogue. And that change came early 2020. In February 2020, President Ibrahim Keita, he was at that time the president of Mali, but was deposed later on, a few months after that, came out and stated in the television that he is willing to explore the way of dialogue with jihadist groups.
Nous avons au Mali tenté la gageure d'un dialogue national inclusif. Et parmi les recommandations, il y a cet aspect-là. Pourquoi pas essayer le contact avec ceux-là dont nous savons qu'ils tirent les ficelles de la situation au Mali.
Only a few weeks later, the jihadists responded back and saying that we also are willing to engage in dialogue with the government. If you accept these conditions, and part of the conditions that they asked for is the withdrawal of foreign troops from Mali. In Burkina Faso, we also had a shift starting in 2020, when the government really reached out to the jihadist groups and brokered a deal with them that allowed the government to organize an election, that provide a ceasefire at the local level, particularly in the Sahel region. And that was actually, I think, one of the best examples of how government could engage directly with jihadist leadership and produce at least a temporary peace via dialogue engagements. In Niger, 2022, we saw the government coming out and announcing that they have sent emissaries to the jihadist groups to start discussion with them about ending this war that has been devastating not only for the government, for their communities themselves, for the parties, but also for the communities that were living in those areas. So we saw a shift really in all three countries between 2020 and 2022 shift towards engagement with jihadist groups in dialogue. What is clear to us is really that we influence the debate significantly, by bringing analysis on how dialogue could be put forward. We saw the region going through significant changes over the last few years, and dialogue has also suffered from those changes that happened. In particular, we saw military taking over from elected officials. We saw a coup, 2 coups in Mali. We saw 2 coups in Burkina Faso. And there was a coup in Niger in July 2023. Those coups have had some impact in terms of reversing some of the achievements that were made. Military leaders usually are the people who mobilize their troops to accept the supreme sacrifice in fighting the jihadist groups. It is very difficult for an officer to send his troops to the field to fight jihadists and tell those that we are negotiating with those jihadist groups. Military leaders might continue to think that they may solve this problem via military intervention, but we think that sooner or later they will come back to the idea of a political solution to this crisis, and partly the political solution should include dialogue engagement with the jihadist groups. We will continue to advocate for this despite the setbacks. We are convinced that this crisis is not going to end militarily. So for us, I think we're very proud of having influenced the debate about how dialogue could be used in order to produce an exit strategy, and this message will carry it on until we see that solution coming around.